Okay, so we'll move on now to questions for our panelists. We've got Dr. Mohammed Taser Safi over here as well. So we'll start with the room, and if anybody online has questions, again, please put them into the question and answer box, and our speakers can look at that, and we'll also try to bring them to the room as well. So questions from the room.
Sorry to be the first. So thank you all, very interesting talks. So my question is for Ferdinand. So you said that only LEGs, we can change our effect, right?
We
can change our effect.
Yeah.
Which entails that we have freedom, right? Free agency.
Yes.
It makes me think how we should understand this Ash'ari tradition. Because the classical Ash'arism is usually defined as holding the two main things. I mean, the main two principles that distinguish them from the Mu'tazila and Imamiyya, where one Jabriya, that we don't have libertarian free will. I mean, our actions are created by God. If I'm not mistaken, or through acquisition task or other mechanisms, but whatever it is, we are not the creator of our actions in the genuine sense of the word. On the other hand, one has said that no, we are free. That's why we have more responsibility. Otherwise, it wouldn't be just for God to punish the sinners, to reward the good doers. And the second thing was the relation between morality and Sharia or God. So they tell we want to know really. And on the other hand, Mu'tazila rejected God theory, right? They believe in the truth and al-aqli, al-husn al-aqli. Ash'ari believe in al-husn al-shari. Now, there is no moral goodness or badness, but divine commands and prohibitions, right? But later on, here in LEG, we see that they at least abandoned the Jabriya. So we have freedom. We can change ourselves. We are the author of our own actions, right? We are the agents making the choice. And in a previous lecture by Melvin, we saw that even some Ash'aris of al-Ghazali are not very clear to be holding in Jabriya. They talk about genuine freedom, libertarian freedom in contemporary terminology. So it made me think what really defines the Ash'ari tradition, whether we have to distinguish between classical and later traditions, and what makes them different from their opponents, the Mu'tazili and Imamiyya.
Okay. I'm trying to write down your questions. I normally have a pen and a paper with me. So as for your first question, I think this is a common misconception of even the classical Ash'ari position. They were never Jabriya. But the debate was, do humans create their own actions? So it was an issue of causality. Do humans create their own actions, or does God create one's own actions? But still, the individual has free will. They have the freedom to choose the action, but God creates the action once they've chosen it. So the issue with the Mu'tazilites were, well, if humans choose wrong actions, then you're saying that God creates wrong actions. So the Mu'tazilites said that God creates good actions, but humans create their wrong actions. So the Ash'aris then responded to this saying, but what you're doing is then you're delimiting God's power. You're saying that God, there is another power that exists simultaneously with God's power, which is then a multiplicity of powers. And that's why they had this theory of causality through Kasb. Now, of course, the Ash'ari school evolves from the early period to the after Imam Ghazali's period, and it becomes closer to the Maturidi position on causality in which the idea of free will is different from free choice and God's will. So humans have free will and they have the freedom to choose, and it's within the framework of God's will. So God wills that humans choose, but once humans make that choice, the first cause is the human choice, but the ultimate cause is God's irada, God's qudra that makes it happen. So the Maturidis have this kind of a compromise. And by the Ottoman era, you find that the Maturidi and the Ash'ari schools are overlapping on many of these issues.
So you found the accusation from the Mu'tazili side that,
They're Jabriya.
yeah, that they are Jabriya and therefore they can't account for moral responsibility of human actions. So you find it unjustified, right?
Yeah, it's inaccurate. So the Ash'aris, even the classical Ash'ari kalam, they were always against the Jabriya. So what's happening here, there's a conflation of two separate issues. One is causality with free will and determinism. The other issue with the Mu'tazilites is that they didn't distinguish between rida and irada. So God can will that things happen in the world. So everything that happens, even the wrong, bad things in the world, is within the bounds of God's will. But both the Ash'aris and Maturidis distinguish between rida and irada. It doesn't mean that God is pleased with those actions, but that he has willed to allow people to act freely, even if it means it's wrong, and that he grants them the power to do those actions. So ultimately, all power comes from humans. And then the Maturidis, for example, also would respond to the saying that you might will to do something tomorrow, but we say inshallah, or Muslims say inshallah. Why? Because ultimately it's not our will that will bring something about, it's God's will, because it might be that you plan to get on that airplane tomorrow, but God will make something come up and you just can't get on that airplane. So our will is always bound within the will of God. So those are two separate issues that commonly get conflated in the criticism of the Ash'aris as causality as opposed to free will and determinism.
It's accurate to say that they were occasional, but at the same time left a room for free will. That it's not leading to the action. I mean, who creates the action are God, but human beings only make the choice without the consequence being the action realized.
Right.
And that's the basis of moral responsibility and deserving punishment for reward or all other ethical aspects.
Right. They were never Jabriya. That was something they were very much against. That's a common critique and misconception of the Ash'aris, even the classical school. They were always against the Jabriya.
How about the other principle? Divine command theory.
Remind me what you mean.
So yeah, and we see in
Husn al-Qub.
as
Yeah.
presented that he believed that okay, maybe I presented the question. So the question is that in Al-Hijri we see that ethics and morality is separate from Sharia, right? We saw different virtues that
I'm listening. I'm just writing as you're speaking. Yeah.
Are not coming from Sharia, if I'm not mistaken. So it has it's a separate source of normativity, ethics, something of its own, separate from Sharia. But the common conception of Ash'ari tradition is that there's no morality other than Sharia. I mean, Sharia is the book of morality.
Yeah, so this is again an issue that evolves in the Ash'ari school, and the Maturidis have a little bit of a more nuanced perspective on this. So can our actions good because, what is it? This is actually, isn't this a question of Socrates? So are actions good because the gods say that they are good, or do the gods say that they are good because the actions are inherently good? And this is a question, I believe it was Socrates. No, it was,
I mean,
yeah.
dilemma.
Yes, yes, but it was Socrates who writes this. No,
I think people.
or attributed to Socrates,
So the author is Plato. He wrote
right,
the dialogue between
Right.
Socrates, his fiction, his character, which is not necessarily the
Right.
real character, maybe real Socrates didn't say such a thing. And the other god, the interrupted is Yusuf. Socrates asks Yusuf whether something's good with God. God has ordered, or God orders something that is good. And something we know as Yusuf to do that.
right. So the theologians were addressing the same question within Islamic framework. Is an action good because God said it's good? That means that the only way to know right and wrong is through revelation, or can we know what's right and wrong without revelation? So the Mu'tazilites argued that you can intellectually derive what's right and wrong. The Ash'aris said that one is not accountable for right and wrong until one receives revelation. But things like benefit to society, harm to society, these are things that can be derived by human reason. And there's also universal principles, like everybody knows that killing is bad, stealing is bad. So the Ash'aris, particularly the later Ash'aris, agree upon this. What they differ on is that things related to accountability with God. So that is only, one is only accountable until they receive revelation. And then but the Maturidis say, no, one is still able to recognize something that's halal and haram, or that's good and bad, because God makes what's good halal or required, and God makes what's bad haram, and that human who has a fitra that's sound has the capacity to see these things and recognize them.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to be sure that if there's other questions in the house or online, that we have time for that, because we will have to wrap it up further. So,
Thank you all the panelists. My question is for Taysir, so I'm hoping you can hear me.
can you hear Taysir?
Okay, good. So I wanted to ask you about what there is to be gained for the field of hadith studies or Islamic epistemology by engaging in this comparative study that you've described. Does it enable us to ask different types of questions, do something new, do something differently that we're already doing within that field, or that has historically been done within that field? And then the second part of the question is, are there any limitations or difficulties to this comparative work? You mentioned, for example, that your colleagues in the field of Western epistemology are describing Islamic epistemology as more advanced, but not necessarily true, or they may not agree with some of the methods. So maybe if you can explain what that means. Are there kind of theological presuppositions or historical sociological presuppositions that might constrain what can be done in that regard?
Sorry, we don't hear you for some reason.
Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me?
Yep, now we can hear you.
Sorry, Jazakumullah khairan, Dr. Maryam. I assume that's Dr. Maryam who's asking the question. And I think I heard most of the first one. I definitely heard the second one. Just to kind of, if someone can just like quickly, who's closer to the computer, summarize the first part of the question. Was it, what like basically positives or takeaways come out of this type of contrast and synthesis? Is that about right?
Okay, yeah, sounds like that was right.
Okay, so that's a great question, and inshallah, I really hope that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will grant me the ability to kind of write it in detail. But since you asked, I'll maybe give you a few like nuggets that are kind of easy takeaways. I think one of the two of the most probably positive things for me, one is an actual like item that I think could be interest of for all of you, and I think one is more personal. So the actual kind of takeaway that I think is useful for the field is that the Anglophone tradition has really focused on what I would call more epistemically upstream questions of testimonial justification. There's not going to be enough time to get into like what the reduction versus non-reductionism debate is about, but essentially what they're thinking about is, well, what justifies one's reliance on testimony at like a meta level? Is it kind of its own independent source of knowledge? or is it essentially relying on inference and other types of sources of knowledge? That's a very, very like 101 introduction to the debate. It's much more technical than that. And so for me, when I wrote my dissertation, and this paper is different than the dissertation, but for the dissertation, what I try to show is that this is actually really useful because this type of question is not a question that Hadith scholars are necessarily going to ask. They've got what I would call like a more downstream approach. So they're saying, well, what are the axioms upon which we rely and how do we defend those axioms, these principles, right? And they're what essentially constitute the shurut, and they constitute the entire approach of sharh and ta'dil. So I try to identify those and analyze those philosophically. But then I say, look, we can tie that conversation to the question of reduction versus non-reductionism. Can we kind of characterize what Hadith scholars are doing implicitly as reductionist or non-reductionist, or some type of dualist approach? And basically what I end up doing is I advocate for a dualist approach, but I don't go as far in the dissertation of arguing for why that's like philosophically correct, right? In other words, I'm just, I'm analyzing the Hadithic system, and then I'm trying to kind of tie it to this kind of conversation around reduction. This is a very technical terminology, but the question of reduction essentially is going to get us back to, what justifies a reliance on what other people tell us. Like we could just say, oh, it's dabt and it's, it's adala and it's these types of things, but that's not enough, right? Unless you're just going to say that that's somehow just daruri, right? So contemporary Anglophone, particularly analytic philosophy, is very interested in this kind of debate. And so I've tried to kind of benefit from that. Now, I know I don't want to go too long because I know there's probably people who want to ask questions of the other panelists. The other thing I'll say is it's personal, and I'm writing a different paper about this at the university, that what I essentially am calling like the value of contrast and synthesis for folks who are working within philosophy and various other traditions. That there is just a personal value in it, a growth and an ability to kind of engage with questions that you're not used to asking, right? We're used to in our text, which is good, right? We have this long tradition, 1,400 years, and some of it is tying to conversations from before, as was mentioned by the other panelists. But we're not used to kind of these newer questions that are coming out that are not from within our own tradition, right? And I think that there's a real value in looking at your own texts, again, from a different vantage point. I think it activates a certain part of the text that are not there unless that you do it. And it makes you kind of even see that there are threads in our texts that have kind of, I don't know what word to use here, but maybe like have dulled a little bit or not become as popular, that you can notice that these other traditions are debating that same point. And then you realize, oh, wait, like I'll give you an example and then I'll end there. When I first kind of came to Northwestern like 3 years ago, I was sitting with an epistemologist, and I decided to start with like, what are definitions of knowledge in our tradition? So I was like sharing with them. He started asking me all these questions, but what would they say about this? What would they say about that? So I was like, I'll get back to you. So I went back to the text and I was looking at other definitions that I had largely like ignored, right? Because, they list out all the different definitions. And I started to see, wow, some of these other definitions, they seem to be like tracking this contemporary philosopher's concern, right? I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but I'm saying like, I wouldn't have known that personally had I not come into contact with somebody who holds a view that's concerned with that, right? So I think there's like a ilmi, like objective is too strong for it, but there's like a ilmi thing that in the ulum themselves, but I think there's a personal value of activating those things in the student and the researcher as well.
All right, thank you very much. A brief shameless plug for the Verification and Renewal Curriculum Project for ASIPT. We are working on an essay on epistemology that we'll be sending to Dr. Mohammed very shortly for his proofreading and opinions, and to anyone else that is interested, inshallah, in Islamic epistemology essay. What I'd like to suggest is that for those who are present, if there are more questions for our panelists, that we take this opportunity to continue the conversation. For those who need to pray Asr, take a short break. Prayers across the hall the rugs are still there. Coffee and snacks in the room next door. And we'll come back for our next panel. If we can, we'll try to do it at about 20 of. But please do keep the conversation going for those of you who are present. And of course, if you want to hop on the screen and continue talking with Mohammed as well, you're welcome to come on. Come on.
I need to go get some rest, but jazakumullah.
Okay. Thank you so much. Jazakumullahu khairan. And thank you to our panelists. And we'll keep the conversation going, inshallah.